Stop relying on people. Build a mind that doesn't need anyone. There is something most people will never admit to themselves. Not because it is too painful, not because it is too complex, but because it requires a level of honesty that most people are not willing to apply to their own lives. Here it is. The reason your mood changes when someone doesn't respond to your message, that is not love. That is not connection. That is dependence. The reason your confidence drops when someone doesn't approve of your decision, that is not sensitivity. That is not care. That is a structural weakness in how you relate to yourself. The reason your entire day can be destabilized by a single conversation, that is not because people are difficult. That is because somewhere along the way, you built your internal stability on something outside of you, on someone else's behavior, on someone else's approval, on someone else's presence. And here's what that means in practice. The moment that person changes, and they will change, your stability disappears with them. The moment they become unavailable, and they will, your sense of direction disappears with them. The moment they stop providing what you have been quietly depending on, your sense of self weakens. You were not designed for this kind of fragility, but you have been conditioned into it. This audiobook is not about removing people from your life. It is not about becoming cold, isolated, or indifferent. It is not about distrusting everyone around you or building walls between yourself and the world. This is about something far more precise. It is about removing your dependence on people while keeping your connection to them intact. It is about building a mind that does not require external validation to function. A mind that does not collapse when support is withdrawn. A mind that chooses deliberately, consciously, how much weight to place on the opinions and behaviors of others. Because the most dangerous position you can occupy is one where another person's mood becomes your mood, where another person's absence becomes your crisis, where another person's approval becomes your permission to move forward. That is not relationship. That is a vulnerability you have disguised as connection. What follows is a precise examination of how dependence forms, how it costs you, and how to build the internal architecture that makes it unnecessary. Not through willpower alone, not through motivational language, but through understanding, deep, structural understanding of what is actually happening inside your mind when you rely on others more than you rely on yourself. By the end of this, you will think differently, not because you were told to, but because you will have seen clearly what dependence actually is. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Let's begin. Introduction. The problem with relying on others. Dependence feels like connection. That is the first and most important thing to understand. It feels warm. It feels like closeness. It feels like trust. And because it mimics the feeling of genuine connection, it is extraordinarily easy to confuse the two, not just in how you describe your relationships to others, but in how you understand them to yourself. This confusion is not accidental. It is the product of how human beings are shaped from the very beginning of their lives. You were born into dependence. You needed others to survive, not metaphorically but literally. As an infant, as a child, as someone learning how the world worked, your entire existence depended on the people around you responding to your needs. That dependency was not a weakness. It was biology. It was necessity. It was exactly as it should have been. But somewhere in the transition from childhood to adulthood, a shift was supposed to happen. The dependence that kept you alive as a child was supposed to gradually transform into something different, into a capacity to rely on yourself to self-direct, self-regulate, self-sustain. To be able to sit with your own thoughts without needing someone to validate them. To make decisions without requiring someone's approval before you could act on them. To feel stable not because someone was present, but because you had developed a strong enough internal foundation to hold yourself steady. For most people, that shift never fully happened. Not because they are weak, not because they are broken, but because nobody taught them how to make it. Because the culture around them continued to reward dependence. Because the relationships they formed reinforced the idea that needing others deeply, needing their attention, their approval, their presence, their consistent behavior was the same as loving them. And so the dependency that was appropriate at age 5 became the architecture through which an adult navigates the world. Hidden beneath language like "I just care deeply" or "I'm very sensitive" or "I value connection." Disguised as depth of feeling. Disguised as loyalty. Disguised as love. But let us be precise about what emotional dependence actually is. Emotional dependence is the condition in which your internal state, your mood, your confidence, your sense of stability, your sense of identity is structured around the behavior, presence, approval, or opinion of someone outside of you. When that person behaves as expected, you feel stable. When they don't, you don't. When they are available, you feel grounded. When they are not, you feel adrift. When they validate your decision, you feel certain. When they question it, your certainty dissolves. The key characteristic of emotional dependence is that your internal experience is driven from the outside in. The external determines the internal. The other person holds the variable, and your emotional state is the dependent outcome. That is a structurally unstable way to live. And here is what makes it particularly difficult to address most of the time. It works, or at least it appears to work. When the people you depend on are consistent, when they behave as you expect, when they provide the validation and attention and presence you have come to require, life feels manageable. You feel okay, you feel even, perhaps happy, and because it works in the short term, there is no immediate pressure to examine it, no immediate incentive to change it. The problem surfaces the moment that external consistency breaks down, and it always does. People change. People leave. People become unavailable. People become preoccupied with their own lives. People stop responding in the ways you have grown accustomed to. People disappoint you not necessarily through malice, but simply through being human, through being unpredictable, through having their own needs and limitations and growth. And when that happens, when the external source of stability shifts or disappears, the person who has built their internal architecture on that source discovers how fragile that architecture actually is. The anxiety is sudden, the hurt is disproportionate, the instability is genuine, and what tends to follow is not insight, but behavior, the behavior of someone trying to restore the external condition that had been providing the internal comfort, reaching out more, seeking reassurance, adjusting their own behavior to bring the other person back to where they were, doing more, being more, contracting into whatever shape seems most likely to maintain the connection. This is the cycle of emotional dependence, and it is exhausting, not just for you, but for everyone around you. Because dependence, even when it is quiet, even when it is well disguised, places an invisible weight on relationships. It turns connection into a transaction, even when neither person intends it that way. It converts the relationship from something freely chosen into something structurally required. And that shift, over time, changes the nature of the relationship in ways that erode it. People feel the pressure of being someone else's primary source of stability. Even when they love the person, even when they want to be supportive, there is a point at which the weight becomes difficult to carry. The relationship stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a responsibility. And responsibility without choice is not the foundation on which lasting connection is built. So the very thing that dependence seeks to secure closeness, stability, continued presence, it undermines through its own mechanics. There is also the question of what dependence costs you internally. When your stability is contingent on someone else's behavior, you cannot develop a fully reliable relationship with yourself. Because your self-trust is intermittent, available when the external conditions support it, unavailable when they don't. You cannot learn to trust your own judgment because your judgment is constantly being filtered through the question of what others will think. You cannot develop genuine confidence because genuine confidence does not require an external audience to exist. You also cannot fully inhabit your own experience because a significant portion of your mental and emotional energy is continually directed outward, monitoring others, interpreting signals, managing impressions, calculating how to maintain the external conditions that keep your internal world stable. This is cognitive and emotional labor that never stops, and it takes up space that could otherwise be occupied by thought, by creativity, by presence, by actual depth of living. What this audiobook offers is a different way to be organized internally. Not a way that makes you cold, not a way that makes you indifferent to others, but a way that makes you structurally independent so that your relationships are chosen, not required, so that your stability is built, not borrowed, so that your confidence is internal, not contingent. This is not a small shift. It will require genuine examination of how you currently relate to yourself and to others. It will require honesty about patterns you may not have examined directly before. And it will require a willingness to let the discomfort of that examination lead somewhere productive rather than retreating from it. But if you are willing to do that, and the fact that you are here suggests you are, then what is waiting on the other side of this process is something worth pursuing. Not independence as isolation, but independence as freedom, as choice, as the capacity to engage with others fully, without needing them to sustain you. That is the beginning. Now let us go deeper. Chapter 1. Why you depend on others. You were taught to rely on others, not through a single lesson, not through any deliberate instruction, but through the accumulated experience of living in a world that consistently rewarded that reliance and made self-direction feel dangerous. This is the first thing to understand about dependence. It was not a choice you made consciously. It was a pattern that formed gradually in response to the conditions you encountered. And because it formed gradually, because it was built into the architecture of how you learn to navigate life, it can be difficult to see it from the inside. It does not feel like a pattern. It feels like you. But you are not your patterns. You are the awareness that can examine them. And examining this particular pattern is where everything begins. Let's start with the most fundamental mechanism: social conditioning. From the earliest moments of your life, the people around you communicated through their reactions, through their approval, through their disappointment, what was acceptable and what was not. You learned, long before you could articulate it, that certain behaviors produced warmth and certain behaviors produced withdrawal. That being what others wanted you to be produced safety. That being something different produced discomfort, correction, or distance. This is not a criticism of the people who raised you. Most of them were working from the same conditioning they had received. They were passing on the patterns they knew. But the effect of that process, over time, is that you learn to orient yourself outward rather than inward. To check the external environment for signals about who you should be and how you should behave, rather than developing a reliable internal compass. By the time you were old enough to begin forming your own identity, you were already deeply practiced at looking to others for direction, at adjusting yourself based on feedback, at prioritizing the external over the internal. The habit was already installed. And then came the social structures that reinforced it. School systems that reward compliance and penalize deviation. Cultural messaging that presents belonging, social acceptance, being liked, being needed as the primary markers of a successful life. Relationships that operate on the implicit understanding that your value is measured by how well you meet others' expectations. Workplaces where advancement depends on managing perceptions. Every one of these structures, in its own way, continues the education that began in childhood. Your worth is external. Your safety is contingent on others' approval. The most important thing you can do is be what others need you to be. This is not a conspiracy. It is simply how systems built by dependent people tend to reinforce dependence. And you have been living inside these systems your entire life. But the conditioning alone does not explain the full depth of the pattern. Because beneath the social learning, there is something more fundamental at work. There is fear. Specifically, there is the fear of being alone with yourself. This is one of the most under-examined aspects of emotional dependence, and it is one of the most important. Because when people seek validation, when they reach for approval, when they structure their decisions around what others will think, part of what is driving that behavior is a discomfort with their own internal experience when external input is absent. Being alone with your thoughts, truly alone, without distraction, without someone to check in with, without the ambient noise of other people's presence, is an experience that many people find genuinely uncomfortable. Not because they are weak, but because they have never developed the capacity to be at ease there. Think about what happens when you are waiting for a response to something important. When you send a message and you are watching for a reply. When you made a decision and you were waiting for someone to confirm it was the right one. The discomfort in that waiting, the urge to reach out again, to check again, to say something, to fill the silence, that is the discomfort of being alone with an unresolved internal state. And if you are not accustomed to sitting with that discomfort, if you have not developed the capacity to regulate your own internal states without external input, then the quickest path to relief is to seek that external input, to get the response, to get the reassurance, to get the presence that quiets the internal noise. This works in the short term, but every time it works, it deepens the pattern because you learn again. that the way to feel better is to go outward. And the skill of tolerating your own internal experience of sitting with uncertainty, with unresolved feeling, with the discomfort of not knowing remains undeveloped. There is also the role of emotional need. Human beings have genuine needs for connection, for belonging, for feeling understood and seen. These are not signs of weakness. They are part of what it means to be human. The question is not whether you have these needs. The question is how you relate to them. A person with a healthy relationship to their emotional needs acknowledges them without being controlled by them. They can feel the desire for connection without that desire becoming urgent or desperate. They can want someone's understanding without needing that understanding in order to function. They can value approval without being destabilized by its absence. A person with an unhealthy relationship to their emotional needs, a relationship shaped by the kind of conditioning we have been discussing, treats those needs as emergencies. The desire for connection becomes a compulsion. The want becomes a requirement, and the absence of what they need becomes a crisis rather than an inconvenience. This is not because their needs are greater. It is because the mechanism for managing those needs, the capacity to self-regulate, to self-soothe, to bring themselves back to stability without external intervention, was never fully developed. And so the habit forms and deepens. Because that is what dependence ultimately is, a habit. A deeply ingrained, thoroughly reinforced, emotionally supported habit. It is the automatic movement toward others when your internal state becomes uncomfortable. It is the default orientation outward when your internal orientation has not been sufficiently strengthened. Habits are powerful because they operate below the level of conscious decision. You do not decide to seek reassurance every time you feel uncertain. You simply find yourself doing it. You do not decide to structure your mood around someone else's behavior. You simply notice, after the fact, that your mood has changed because theirs did. This automaticity is what makes dependence so difficult to address through willpower alone. You cannot simply decide to stop being dependent any more than you can decide to stop having any other deeply embedded habit. The decision to change must be followed by a different practice, a consistent, deliberate, repeated engagement with a different way of responding to your internal states. That different practice is what this audiobook builds chapter by chapter. But before you can build something new, you need to see the old structure clearly. And part of seeing it clearly is recognizing how much of your current dependence was never about weakness of character. It was about the absence of an alternative architecture. Nobody taught you how to self-direct in the deepest sense. Nobody taught you how to sit with your own uncertainty without requiring external resolution. Nobody taught you how to make decisions from a secure internal position rather than from a position that required external validation to feel stable. You learned what you learned in the environment you were in, and that learning was rational given the circumstances. It was adaptive. It served a purpose. But you are no longer in those circumstances. You are an adult with the capacity for reflection, with the ability to examine your own patterns, with the cognitive resources to build something more sophisticated than what was handed to you. And that is exactly what this process is for. The dependence you carry is not a permanent feature of who you are. It is the product of what you were taught, and what was learned can be examined. What was examined can be understood, and what is understood can be changed, not quickly, not without effort, but with the kind of deliberate consistency that produces real transformation. You were taught to rely on others rather than to lead yourself. That is where it started. Now it changes. Chapter 2. The illusion of support. Support is not guaranteed. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths about human relationships, and it is one that dependence requires you to ignore. The structure of emotional dependence is built on an implicit assumption that the support you have come to rely on will continue, that the person who is currently providing consistency will keep providing it, that the relationship will hold its shape, that what exists today will still exist tomorrow in the same form. This assumption is understandable, but it is fundamentally at odds with the nature of people and relationships. People change. This is not a pessimistic observation. It is simply accurate. The person you are closest to right now is not the same person they were 5 years ago, and they will not be the same person 5 years from now. Their needs change, their circumstances change, their values evolve, their capacity for certain kinds of connection shifts over time. Sometimes those changes bring people closer together. Often they pull people in different directions. This is not a failure of the relationship. It is not a failure of the person. It is simply the natural consequence of two people living, growing, and changing across time. But if your stability has been built on a specific version of that person, on the particular way they showed up for you at a particular point in time, then their natural growth and change becomes a threat. Not because it is harmful, but because it disrupts the external conditions on which your internal stability depends. There is also the more immediate reality of human inconsistency. People are not constants. They have their own internal states, their own stress, their own preoccupations, their own struggles that affect how much they can give at any given moment. The friend who was reliably available last month is consumed by a professional crisis this month. The partner who was emotionally present last year is navigating their own internal difficulties this year. The mentor whose guidance shaped your thinking has moved on to a different set of priorities. None of this is betrayal. None of it is a withdrawal of love. It is simply the variability that comes with being human. But if your dependence requires consistency, if your stability is built on the expectation that this person will continue to show up in the specific way that keeps your internal world stable, then their ordinary human variability becomes experienced as abandonment, as disappointment, as a failure of the relationship. And the pain of that experience is real. The felt sense of abandonment is genuine, even when the actual abandonment has not occurred. But the pain is not evidence that the other person has done something wrong. The pain is evidence of the structural gap between what dependence requires and what people are actually capable of providing. This is the illusion of support. Not that support is not real, not that people do not genuinely want to help you, care for you, be there for you. Many of them do. But the illusion is this, that this support can be relied upon as a structural foundation for your internal life, that it can be the bedrock on which you build your stability, your confidence, your sense of direction. It cannot. Not because people are unreliable in a cynical sense, but because no external source can provide what only an internal foundation can provide: consistency, permanence, the kind of steady ground that does not shift depending on what someone else is going through. Think about the nature of expectations in relationships. When you depend on someone, you develop expectations often without realizing it, often without communicating them. You expect that they will respond in a certain time frame, that they will prioritize you in certain ways, that they will be available when you need them, that they will provide the particular kind of support that makes you feel secure. These expectations are not always unreasonable in their content, but they become problematic when their fulfillment becomes the condition for your internal stability, when the expectation is not just a preference but a structural requirement, when its non-fulfillment triggers genuine distress, genuine destabilization. You have moved from preference into dependence. And the other person, who may not even know the weight of what they are being required to provide, cannot help but eventually fall short. Not because they don't care, but because they are human, and humans are imperfect, inconsistent, and genuinely limited in what they can give. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from unrealized expectations. It is not the clean pain of a clear loss. It is a murkier, more corrosive kind of pain, the pain of chronic low-level disappointment, of feeling let down repeatedly without being able to articulate exactly why, of a slow erosion of trust, not because anything particularly dramatic happened, but because the subtle gap between what was expected and what was delivered accumulated over time into something significant. This kind of suffering is the natural output of emotional dependence, and because its source is internal, because it is generated by the structure of your expectations rather than by anything the other person has objectively done wrong, it cannot be resolved by changing the other person's behavior. It can only be resolved by changing the internal structure that generates those expectations. The reality of relationships, honestly examined, is this. Other people are doing their best within their own limitations. They are navigating their own lives, their own fears, their own growth, with the tools and capacities they currently have. They will give what they can give when they can give it. And there will be times when what they can give is less than what you want, less than what you have come to depend on, less than what you feel you need. That is not an indictment of them. It is simply the reality of sharing space with other human beings who have their own interior lives, their own constraints, their own changing circumstances. Accepting this reality, genuinely accepting it, not just intellectually acknowledging it, but integrating it into the structure of how you relate to others, is one of the most important things you can do for your own internal stability. Because acceptance of this reality is not resignation. It is not a lowering of standards for your relationships. It is a clearing away of the unrealistic expectation that another person can be what only you can be for yourself, a constant, reliable, always available source of stability and direction. When you stop expecting that from others, something interesting happens. The relationships themselves often improve because you stop relating to people from a position of requirement. You stop, subtly and unconsciously, burdening them with the weight of being your foundation. And when that weight is removed, they can be what they actually are, which is often quite good, quite caring, quite real, without the impossible task of also being your primary source of internal stability. The relationship becomes genuinely a relationship, two people who choose each other, who contribute to each other's lives, who find genuine value in each other's company without one person secretly depending on the other to hold their internal world together. This is not a distant or abstract goal. It is the natural outcome of doing the internal work that the rest of this audiobook addresses. But it begins here with an honest acknowledgement of what support is and what it is not. Support is real. Human connection is real. Care is real. But support is a structural foundation. Support is the bedrock of your internal stability. Support is something you can count on to be consistently present regardless of what the other person is going through. That is the illusion. And every time you operated as though that illusion were reality, every time you organized your internal life around the expectation of consistent external support, you were building on ground that was never designed to hold your weight. What you need to build instead is a foundation that actually can hold your weight, one that is internal, one that remains stable regardless of what is happening externally, one that does not shift when people change, when they become unavailable, when they disappoint. That foundation exists. You are capable of building it. But it requires you to stop placing your weight on the illusion first to see clearly that support, as you have been relying on it, was never what it appeared to be. Not because the people in your life have failed you, but because what you were asking for was never something they had the capacity to give. This is not a painful conclusion if you let it land properly. It is a liberating one. Because once you stop requiring from others what they cannot provide, you stop being disappointed when they don't provide it. And once you stop being disappointed, you can begin to see what they actually do provide, which, when you are not measuring it against an impossible standard, is often quite meaningful. But first, you have to let go of the illusion that support is guaranteed. The illusion that consistency is something others can provide. The illusion that your stability can safely rest on someone else. It cannot, and now you know it cannot. What comes next is building something that can actually hold. Chapter 3. Losing yourself in others. There is a particular kind of disappearance that happens slowly, almost invisibly, not through a single dramatic event, but through an accumulation of small adjustments, small concessions, small movements away from what you actually think and feel and want, all of them justified, in the moment, by the logic of connection, by the desire to be liked, by the need to be accepted. You move toward others, and in doing so, you move away from yourself. This is the mechanism of identity loss in the context of dependence, and it is subtler and more pervasive than most people realize. It begins with something that seems entirely reasonable: wanting to be understood, wanting to be accepted, wanting to fit into the social environments you inhabit. These are natural desires, but when they are driven by dependence, when they are not preferences but requirements, they begin to exert a quiet pressure on who you are. Because the need to be accepted requires you, at some level, to make yourself acceptable, and making yourself acceptable requires monitoring constantly, often below the level of conscious awareness, how you are being perceived. What others approve of, what makes them comfortable, what generates warmth versus what generates distance. And over time, that monitoring shapes behavior. You begin to emphasize the parts of yourself that receive approval and suppress the parts that don't. You modulate your opinions based on who is in the room. You adjust your preferences to match those of the people whose approval matters to you. You present different versions of yourself in different contexts, not out of deliberate deception, but out of a practiced, automatic responsiveness to the social environment. Each of these adjustments in isolation seems minor, but their cumulative effect over months and years is significant. At a certain point, if you have been doing this long enough, you may find yourself sitting with a question that is genuinely uncomfortable, a question that many people spend considerable energy avoiding. Who am I when no one is watching? What do I actually think when I am not filtering it through what others might want to hear? What do I actually want when I am not adjusting my wants based on what seems socially acceptable? What kind of life would I build if I were building it entirely for myself, not for approval? Not to avoid judgment, but because it genuinely reflected what I value? For many people, these questions produce a kind of blankness, not because there are no answers, but because they have been so thoroughly externally oriented for so long that the internal signal, the authentic, unfiltered sense of self, has grown faint. This is what approval seeking does over time. It does not just change your behavior. It erodes your ability to distinguish your own preferences from the preferences you have adopted. It weakens your connection to your own judgment. It creates a subtle but persistent uncertainty about your own perspective because your perspective has been calibrated for so long by external feedback rather than internal clarity. The hunger for approval is not a character flaw. It is an understandable response to a deep human need, the need to belong, to be seen, to matter to others. But when that hunger becomes the primary driver of how you present yourself and what you allow yourself to be, it begins to extract a cost that is significant. The cost is you. There is a word for the behavior of adjusting yourself so completely to the expectations and preferences of others that your own distinct character becomes secondary. Cover-adaptation. Cover-adaptation is not the same as being considerate. Being considerate means being genuinely attentive to how your behavior affects others, while still maintaining a clear sense of who you are and what you stand for. Cover-adaptation means subordinating your sense of self to the requirements of social acceptance, to the point where your internal experience becomes secondary to the management of external impressions. It is exhausting, not just practically but in a deeper sense, because the cognitive and emotional labor of maintaining an identity that is calibrated to external approval, an identity that has to shift and adjust in response to different environments, different audiences, different expectations, is work that never stops. There is no moment of rest in it, because the approval-seeking mechanism does not turn off when you are alone. It plays forward into future interactions, rehearsing scenarios, calculating responses, preparing for the social management that the next day will require. And beneath all of that management, there is often a quiet but persistent anxiety. The anxiety of someone who has lost touch with their own ground, who does not know, with genuine confidence, who they are independent of what others think of them. This is not an abstract description. If you have spent significant time in approval-seeking mode, you likely recognize this experience, the sense that your sense of self is somehow provisional, the feeling that you are always slightly off-center, always slightly performing, the discomfort of being asked a direct question about what you want or think or believe, and feeling the familiar impulse to check internally, almost unconsciously, what answer would be most acceptable before offering it. The boundary problem is closely related to this. Weak boundaries are not primarily a failure of assertiveness. They are a structural consequence of dependence. When your sense of stability, when your sense of being okay depends on maintaining the approval of others, saying no becomes genuinely threatening. not in an abstract way, but in an immediate, felt sense, because saying no risks disapproval, and disapproval threatens the external source of stability you have been depending on. So you say yes when you mean no. You agree when you disagree. You accommodate when you would rather not. Not out of generosity. Genuine generosity is something different, but out of an implicit calculation that the cost of maintaining approval is worth more than the cost of the accommodation. And this calculation, made repeatedly across many situations, teaches you something about yourself. It teaches you that your own needs and boundaries are less important than others' approval. It reinforces the pattern of prioritizing the external over the internal. And it further erodes the internal clarity and confidence that would make genuine self-direction possible. There is a particular quality to the self that has been subordinated in this way. It is not an absence. It is a kind of quiet pressure, the felt sense of something unexpressed, something held back, something that wants to be said or done or decided, but that has been trained to wait for permission from the outside before moving. And that waiting, that practice self-suppression, is one of the most significant costs of dependence. Because what you suppress does not disappear. It accumulates. It finds expression in subtle ways, in resentment, in fatigue, in the low-level dissatisfaction that comes from living a life that is partly yours and partly shaped by what others required you to be. The path out of this begins with a deceptively simple practice. It begins with noticing, not with immediately changing your behavior that often creates its own kind of rigidity, but with developing the habit of noticing when the approval-seeking mechanism is active. When you are about to say something and feel the impulse to soften it, modify it, or withhold it entirely based on how it might be received. When you are about to make a decision and feel yourself scanning for external validation before proceeding. When you are in a conversation and notice yourself performing a version of yourself rather than simply being present. Just notice, without self-criticism, without the judgment that would turn the noticing into another form of approval seeking your own approval for being sufficiently self-aware. Simply notice, observe the mechanism in operation. See it clearly. Because seeing it clearly is the first step to having a choice about it. You cannot choose differently if you are not aware that a choice is being made. And for most people, the approval-seeking mechanism operates so automatically, so below the level of conscious awareness, that it has never been observed directly at all. The second part of the path is reestablishing contact with your own perspective. This is different from asserting yourself. It is more fundamental than that. It is the practice of asking yourself, consistently and honestly, what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually want, before filtering that through the question of what others will think. Not in order to always act on it. Not in order to abandon consideration of others entirely, but to know what it is, to have it clearly, to maintain contact with your own internal signal even as you navigate the social world. Because you cannot be in genuine relationship with others, you cannot offer them anything real if you have lost contact with what is real in you. The self that has been subordinated to approval seeking is not gone. It has simply learned to be quiet, to wait, to recede. The work of this chapter and of everything that follows is to stop requiring it to wait, to stop making its expression contingent on the approval that will never be reliable enough, consistent enough, or durable enough to be worth the cost. The more you depend on others for a sense of self, the less self there is to bring to the relationship. And the less you bring, the more you need. It is a cycle that only moves in one direction unless you intervene. Now you are intervening. Chapter 4. Taking back control. Control, in the sense we are discussing here, is not about power over others. It is not about domination or manipulation or the kind of rigid resistance that mistakes inflexibility for strength. Control, properly understood, is about something far simpler and far more important. It is about being the primary author of your own internal experience and your own decisions. It is about the movement of your life being driven by your own considered judgment rather than by the shifting conditions of your external environment. When you are dependent, you have ceded that authorship. You have handed the primary influence over your internal state and often over your decisions to the variable behavior of others. Your mood follows their mood. Your confidence follows their approval. Your direction follows their validation. Taking back control begins with a single recognition. You are responsible for your own experience. Not in a way that denies the reality of what others do. Not in a way that pretends that other people's behavior has no effect on you. Of course it does. Human beings are social creatures, and we are genuinely influenced by the people around us. But there is a difference between being influenced by others and being controlled by them. Being influenced means that their behavior is one input among many in how you navigate a given situation. Being controlled means that their behavior is the primary determinant of your internal state, that the external variable is what drives the internal outcome. Responsibility, in this context, means taking ownership of that internal outcome rather than attributing it entirely to what others do or don't do. It means asking not just what did they do, but how am I choosing to respond. It means recognizing that while you cannot control what others do, you have significant and largely underdeveloped capacity to shape how you respond to it. This is not a comfortable recognition for people who have been operating in a dependent mode, because it removes a certain kind of explanation. When your stability is driven from the outside in, there is always an external cause for your internal state. When things are difficult, it is because of what someone did or didn't do. When you feel bad, it is because of how you were treated. When you cannot move forward, it is because you have not received the support you needed. These explanations are not entirely wrong. Context matters. Other people's behavior genuinely affects us. But when these explanations become the primary lens through which you understand your experience, they produce a particular kind of passivity, a waiting, a dependency not just on other support, but on their behavior as the explanation for your internal state. And as long as you are in the business of explaining your internal state through external causes, you cannot take genuine responsibility for it, because you cannot change what others do. You can only work with what you do in response. Decision independence is one of the most practical expressions of taking back control. Watch how you make decisions, not the content of the decisions themselves, but the process. What happens in your mind when you have a decision to make? Where does your attention go? If dependence is active, attention typically goes outward first. The immediate question is, what will others think of this? What would they advise? What decision would receive approval? What is the safest option given how it will be perceived? And often, a decision is not fully made, is not felt as settled until someone whose approval matters has weighed in and found it acceptable. This is decision-making through external validation. And while getting input from others is not inherently problematic, good decisions often benefit from perspective. The structural problem is when external input is required for the decision to feel legitimate. When you cannot fully trust your own judgment without another person's confirmation. Decision independence does not mean making every decision in isolation. It means making decisions that are primarily grounded in your own considered judgment, in your own values, your own knowledge, your own assessment of the situation, and then seeking input selectively when it would genuinely add something, rather than seeking it reflexively as a way of managing your own uncertainty. The difference is subtle but significant. In the first case, external input is a resource. In the second, it is a requirement. In the first case, you remain the author of the decision. In the second, authorship is partly outsourced. The practice of decision independence is uncomfortable at first. This is worth acknowledging clearly, because if you begin this practice and encounter discomfort, you may interpret that discomfort as evidence that something is wrong. It is not. It is simply the discomfort of operating without a support system you have been accustomed to. Think of it like learning to balance on an unfamiliar surface. The first attempts are unstable. You have to make constant small adjustments. It takes more effort than the old way. But the instability is not because you are incapable. It is because the muscles being asked to work, the internal muscles of self-trust and self-direction, have not been consistently used in this way before. They strengthen with use. This is not metaphor. The internal capacity to make decisions from a grounded internal position becomes more natural and less effortful the more consistently you engage it. Self-direction is the broader practice that decision independence lies within. Self-direction means that the primary source of orientation in your life, the answer to the question of where you are going and why, comes from the inside rather than the outside. It means that your choices, your priorities, your actions are organized around your own values and understanding of what matters, rather than around what will receive approval or what will avoid disapproval. This does not mean you never adjust to feedback. It does not mean you never consider others' perspectives. But it means that the primary orientation is internal, that you have a settled enough sense of your own values and direction that you can receive external input, weigh it, and then make a decision that is genuinely yours rather than a decision that was made for you by the social environment. There is a quality that characterizes people who have developed genuine self-direction. You can usually feel it in how they occupy a room, in how they speak, in how they handle disagreement. They are present in their own perspective without needing to dominate others. They can hold their position without aggression because their position is not contingent on others agreeing with it. They can hear dissenting views without being destabilized by them, because their sense of what they think is not dependent on others finding it acceptable. They can be wrong without it becoming a crisis, because their self-worth is not structured around being right in others' eyes. This is not arrogance, it is composure. It is the composure of someone who knows where they stand. Not because others have confirmed it, but because they have done the internal work of actually knowing. Awareness is the prerequisite for all of this. You cannot take back control of something you cannot see, and for many people, the degree to which their decisions, their mood, their sense of self has been externally driven is genuinely not visible from the inside. It is simply how life has always felt, so it registers as reality rather than as a pattern. The awareness this chapter calls for is the awareness of the mechanism. The awareness that there is a process happening between external event and internal response, a process in which you have more agency than you have been exercising. The awareness that the question, why did they do that, is different from the question, how am I responding to this, and why? The first question keeps your attention on others. The second keeps your attention where it can actually produce change on yourself. Taking back control does not happen in a single moment of decision. It happens in the accumulation of small moments, small instances of catching yourself moving outward for validation and choosing, instead, to move inward for grounding, small instances of making a decision and tolerating the discomfort of not immediately seeking confirmation. Small instances of noticing that someone else's mood is shifting and choosing not to allow that shift to determine yours. Each of these small moments is a practice, and practice, sustained and consistent, builds something that willpower alone could never produce: a different architecture, a different way of being organized internally, a mind that is primarily self-directed rather than externally driven. That is control, not over others, over yourself. And it starts now, in the smallest decisions, the most ordinary moments, the habitual movements toward others that you can begin, with awareness, to redirect inward. The control you have been looking for has always been available. You simply have not been looking in the right place for it. Chapter 5. Building internal stability. Stability, as most people have experienced it, is a feeling that comes and goes. It is present when circumstances are favorable and absent when they are not. It arrives when relationships are working, when people are behaving as expected, when nothing significant is under threat, and it disappears when those conditions change. This is not stability, this is comfort. Stability, in the true sense, the kind of internal stability that is actually worth building, does not move with circumstances. It persists through them. It is not the absence of difficulty. It is a quality of your relationship to difficulty that remains fundamentally consistent regardless of what is happening externally. And the critical difference between the two is where they come from. Comfort comes from the outside. It is produced by favorable conditions, by the right people behaving in the right ways, by the absence of significant disruption. You can feel it and it is pleasant, but you cannot build a life on it, because you cannot control the conditions that produce it. And so a life organized around comfort is, by definition, a life organized around what others do and what circumstances provide, which means it is a life organized around things that are fundamentally outside your control. Stability comes from the inside. It is produced by a particular quality of relationship with yourself, a relationship characterized by trust, by consistency, by the capacity to be with your own experience without being overwhelmed by it. It is not dependent on external conditions being favorable, because it is not generated by external conditions at all. Building it requires a different kind of work than most people are accustomed to, not the work of managing the external environment to produce comfort, but the work of developing an internal environment that can produce stability independent of what is happening outside. Emotional balance is the first component of this. Emotional balance is not the suppression of emotion. It is not the absence of feeling. It is not what happens when you are emotionally shut down or disconnected from your internal experience. That is numbness, not balance. Emotional balance is the capacity to feel fully while remaining functionally stable, to experience anger without being consumed by it, to experience fear without being controlled by it, to experience disappointment, frustration, sadness, uncertainty, and to move through those experiences without them overtaking your capacity to think, to decide, to act. This capacity is developed through practice, specifically through the practice of allowing your emotional experience to be present without immediately acting on it, numbing it, or resolving it through external means. When something difficult happens, when you receive news you didn't want, when someone behaves in a way that hurts you, when a situation produces genuine discomfort, the practiced response is to move immediately toward resolution, to fix it, to address it, to call someone and talk it through, to do something to make the feeling stop. This is understandable. Discomfort is unpleasant, and the instinct to move away from it is natural. But the constant movement away from discomfort, the refusal to allow it to exist without immediately being resolved, has a cost. It prevents you from developing the capacity to tolerate it. And the capacity to tolerate internal discomfort, to sit with it, to stay present with it, to allow it to move through you without being destabilized by it, is foundational to internal stability. Because if discomfort always requires external resolution, then stability is always contingent on the external environment remaining comfortable, which means it is not stability at all. The practice here is deliberate and specific. When you notice emotional discomfort of whatever kind, instead of immediately moving to resolve it, you stay with it, not forever, not without limits, but long enough to establish that you can. You notice what the experience is like physically. You observe it from a slight internal distance. You allow yourself to feel it without needing it to stop immediately. And you notice, over time, that you are capable of having the experience without being overwhelmed by it, that it moves, that it changes, that your capacity to function is not, in fact, as dependent on the absence of discomfort as you may have believed. This is not stoicism as indifference. This is not emotional suppression dressed up as discipline. This is the genuine development of emotional tolerance, the capacity to be in the presence of your own difficult internal states without needing to escape them through external means. Self-trust is the second component, and it is closely related. Self-trust is not confidence in the sense of certainty. It is not the conviction that you will always make the right decision or that your judgment is infallible. Those would be delusions, not trust. Self-trust is the confidence that you can handle what you encounter, that when difficulty arrives, when situations are ambiguous, when decisions are hard, when you face something you did not anticipate, you have sufficient internal resources to navigate it. Not perfectly, not without error, but adequately, functionally, with enough stability to move forward. This is different from what emotional dependence produces. Dependence produces a relationship with yourself characterized by a subtle but persistent doubt, a sense that your own resources are not quite sufficient, that you need external support, external validation, external guidance to really be sure, that the judgment you bring to your own life is unreliable without someone else's confirmation. That doubt is not accurate, but it is the natural consequence of having organized your stability around external sources rather than internal ones. Because if your stability comes from outside, then by definition your internal resources are not what you are depending on. And that which you do not depend on, you do not develop. Building self-trust requires something that may initially feel circular. You build it by acting on it before it is fully established, by making decisions from your own judgment before that judgment feels completely reliable, by tolerating your own uncertainty rather than immediately seeking external reassurance, by completing an experience of managing difficulty on your own and registering, consciously and deliberately, that you managed it. Each time you do this, you are building a body of evidence that your internal resources are genuine, that they are adequate, that the doubt was not accurate, or at least not as accurate as you believed. Consistency is the third component of internal stability, and it may be the most underappreciated. Consistency means maintaining a recognizable quality of internal engagement regardless of external conditions. It means that how you show up for yourself, how you attend to your own experience, how you regulate your responses, how you apply your values does not vary dramatically based on what is happening around you. When things are going well, you maintain your practices. When things are difficult, you maintain your practices. When you feel strong, you maintain your practices. When you feel weak, you maintain your practices. This consistency is what separates genuine internal stability from something that only looks like it during favorable conditions. Because the test of internal stability is not how you function when everything is working. It is how you function when things are hard. The practices that build internal stability, the practices of sitting with discomfort, of acting on self-trust, of maintaining consistency, are not complicated, but they require something that complicated things often don't: sustained engagement over time. You cannot build internal stability in an afternoon. You cannot establish it through a single insight, however profound. You build it the way you build any genuine strength, through repeated, consistent engagement with the practice over a period of time long enough for the engagement to produce structural change. The structure that changes is your relationship to your own internal experience, your relationship to your own judgment, your relationship to uncertainty and discomfort. These are not abstract changes. They are felt. They show up in how you navigate ordinary situations, in a quality of groundedness that is present even when things are not ideal. The internal strength that is being built through this process is worth being precise about, because it is easy to mischaracterize. It is not hardness. Hardness is a defensive response, a closing off, a refusal to be affected. Hardness breaks under sufficient pressure because it does not flex. It is not indifference. Indifference is a kind of emotional withdrawal that sacrifices genuine engagement in the name of protection. What is being built is suppleness, groundedness, the capacity to be moved without being swept away, the capacity to feel without being controlled by feeling, the capacity to engage with the difficulty and unpredictability of life without that engagement requiring an external stabilizer. This is internal strength, not the absence of vulnerability, not immunity to being affected, but a depth and quality of internal organization that makes external support supplementary rather than essential. When external support is present, you can enjoy it. When it is absent, you remain functionally stable, not because you are above needing others, but because you have built something internal that does not require them in order to hold. This is the goal of this chapter and of everything this audiobook builds toward. Not a person who needs nobody, but a person whose foundation is their own. Stability must come from within, not because others cannot contribute to your well-being. They can, and they do. But because anything that requires an external condition to remain intact is, by definition, fragile. Build something that is not fragile. Build it from within. Build it through the practices described here, consistently applied, over the time required for them to produce something real. Because when you have that, when your stability is genuinely yours, everything else in your life changes. Your relationships change. Your decisions change. Your relationship to difficulty changes. Not because the world becomes easier, but because you have become capable. Chapter 6. Thinking without influence. Your thoughts are not always yours. This is not a provocative claim. It is a precise description of something that happens constantly, below the level of awareness, in the minds of people who have been shaped by social conditioning, by approval seeking, by the accumulated influence of living in close proximity to others' perspectives for their entire lives. Most people believe they think for themselves. Most people would describe their opinions as their own. Most people would be genuinely surprised, perhaps even offended, to have it suggested that much of what they believe, much of what they assume, much of the framework through which they interpret their experience, was installed by forces outside of them rather than arrived at through independent consideration. But that surprise itself is instructive, because the opinions that feel most deeply our own are often the ones that were absorbed most thoroughly, the ones we never had to consciously consider because they were simply part of the water we swam in from the beginning. The process by which other people's perspectives become your own is neither dramatic nor obvious. It is gradual, incremental, and often invisible. It happens through repetition, through proximity, through the social pressure that quietly shapes what ideas feel safe to hold and which feel dangerous. A perspective repeated often enough by people you respect begins to feel true, not because you have examined it and found it to be so, but because familiarity reads as validity, because when everyone around you holds a certain view, that view begins to feel like common sense rather than opinion, because the cognitive effort of questioning something deeply embedded is greater than the effort of simply accepting it. And so, over time, you accumulate a collection of beliefs, assumptions, and interpretive frameworks, some of which you arrived at yourself, many of which arrive through the influence of your social environment, and you experience the whole collection as your own perspective, as your genuine view of things. The problem with this is not that influence exists. Influence is inevitable. You cannot develop a perspective in complete isolation from others, nor should you try to. Engaging with the ideas, perspectives, and experiences of other people is part of how thinking develops and deepens. The problem is when influence is absorbed unconsciously, when the perspectives of others, of your family, your social group, your culture, the media you consume, the authority figures you have been exposed to enter your thinking not through examination but through osmosis. When you hold views that are not the product of your own engaged consideration but of automatic adoption of whatever was ambient in your environment. Because thinking that has not been examined is not truly yours. It may feel like it is, but it is borrowed, and borrowed thinking produces borrowed choices. and borrowed choices produce a life that is subtly but significantly off from what your own genuine consideration might have produced. There is a particular quality to social pressure that makes it especially effective at shaping thought without detection. Social pressure is rarely explicit. It rarely takes the form of direct instruction or clear argument. Instead, it operates through subtler mechanisms, through the tone with which certain ideas are discussed, through which perspectives receive attention and which are ignored, through the social consequences, however mild, of departing from consensus, through the implicit understanding that certain kinds of thinking are acceptable and certain kinds are not. These mechanisms are not always conscious on the part of the people applying them. Most social pressure is not calculated. It is simply the natural expression of a group attempting to maintain coherence, to reinforce shared assumptions, to protect the perspectives that hold the group together. But the effect on the individual is significant regardless of the intent, because the individual who is not consciously attending to this pressure will naturally drift toward the socially acceptable perspective, not through deliberate conformity, but through the path of least resistance. And when you are emotionally dependent, when your sense of stability, your sense of belonging, your sense of being okay is contingent on maintaining your place in a social environment, the pressure to think in socially approved ways is intensified, because departing from the group's perspective risks the disapproval that dependence makes threatening. This is one of the less examined costs of emotional dependence. It compromises intellectual independence. It makes genuine independent thinking genuinely costly at an emotional level. And so the dependent person tends, without realizing it, to think in ways that confirm and maintain their social position rather than in ways that are most accurate or most genuinely their own. Independent thinking is not the same as contrarianism. It is not the reflexive rejection of received wisdom. It is not thinking differently for the sake of distinction or the performance of originality. Independent thinking is the practice of engaging with ideas from a position that is primarily accountable to evidence and reason, rather than to social acceptance. It is the willingness to arrive at a conclusion that may be uncomfortable, unpopular, or at odds with what the people around you believe if the evidence and the reasoning support that conclusion. This requires a particular kind of courage, not the dramatic courage of public confrontation, but the quieter courage of intellectual honesty, the courage to hold uncertainty without resolving it prematurely in the direction of social comfort. The courage to say, internally and eventually externally, I am not sure I actually agree with this, even when that uncertainty puts you at odds with people whose approval matters to you. Developing independent thinking begins with a practice of observation. Before you accept an idea, before you allow a perspective offered to you by someone else to settle into the category of things, I believe you practice holding it at a slight distance, not with hostility, not with reflexive skepticism, but with genuine examination. What is this claim actually saying? What would need to be true for it to be accurate? What evidence supports it? What evidence might complicate it or contradict it? What are the assumptions it is built on? And are those assumptions sound? This is not a radical practice. It is simply the application of intellectual rigor to the intake of information, something that formal education has long recognized as important, but that life inside social structures often discourages in practice. There is also the practice of distinguishing between what you actually think and what you think you are supposed to think. This distinction is subtler than it sounds, because the perspective you are supposed to hold the one that the people around you expect, that the culture reinforces, that your social position seems to require can feel genuinely like your own. It can feel like conviction rather than conformity. The way to begin to distinguish between them is through the application of one clarifying question. If there were no social consequence to thinking differently, what would I think? If the answer is different from what you currently hold, that is information. It does not necessarily mean your socially shaped view is wrong, but it does mean it has not been fully examined. And it means that what you thought was your perspective was partly the product of social pressure rather than genuine consideration. Clarity, in the context of independent thinking, is the quality that results when your perspective has been genuinely examined and genuinely arrived at. Clarity is not certainty. You can be clear about your position while acknowledging uncertainty about aspects of it. Clarity is not rigidity. You can hold your position clearly while remaining genuinely open to being changed by new evidence. Clarity is the quality of knowing, with some precision, what you actually think and why, of being able to distinguish between the parts of your perspective that are genuinely yours, that you have arrived at through engagement with evidence and reflection, and the parts that were absorbed from your environment without examination. Most people, when they examine their own perspective with this precision, find that the proportion they have genuinely arrived at themselves is smaller than they assumed. This is not a comfortable finding, but it is an accurate one, and accuracy, however uncomfortable, is the beginning of genuine intellectual independence. The goal is not to arrive at a perspective that is untouched by others. That is impossible and undesirable. The goal is to arrive at a perspective that has been genuinely processed through your own consideration, where you are the primary examiner rather than the passive receiver of the ideas you hold. This produces a different quality of thought, a different relationship to your own mind, a mind that can engage with influence, that can take in others' perspectives, consider them seriously, and update when the evidence warrants without being shaped by them passively, without being moved simply by the pressure of repetition or social expectation. That is thinking. Genuine, independent, yours in the fullest sense thinking. And it is one of the most powerful forms of psychological freedom available to you. Your thoughts, genuinely examined, genuinely yours, are one of the most important resources you have. Because from the quality of your thinking comes the quality of your decisions. From the quality of your decisions comes the quality of your actions. From the quality of your actions comes the quality of your life. It is worth knowing what you actually think. It is worth the work of finding out. Chapter 7. Acting without approval. There is a particular kind of paralysis that approval seeking produces. It is not the paralysis of not knowing what to do. Often, the person caught in this pattern knows quite clearly what they want to do. They have the desire, they have some version of a plan. They may even have done the preliminary work of thinking it through. But there is a gap between the knowing and the doing, a pause, a waiting. And in that gap, there is a quiet but powerful question operating: what will others think? This question, what will others think, is perhaps the most reliably paralyzing question in the human experience. because it has no definitive answer. You cannot know with certainty what others will think. You can guess, you can anticipate, you can model their likely response, but you cannot know. And as long as you require an answer to this question before you are willing to act, you are in a position of perpetual waiting, because the answer will never be certain enough. Because even if you receive validation from some people, there will always be others who might not validate. Because the approval of any individual or group is never complete, never permanent, never guaranteed to remain even if it is currently present. And so the waiting continues, the action is deferred. The life is delayed indefinitely in the service of an approval that cannot actually secure itself. Let us be precise about what approval actually is and what it actually provides. Approval is a social signal. It communicates that a particular behavior or decision is accepted within a particular social context. It produces, in the person who receives it, a temporary feeling of social safety, a sense that they are not at risk of exclusion or rejection. This temporary feeling is real, and for a person whose sense of stability is structured around social acceptance, it is powerfully reinforcing. It is one of the most effective short-term regulators of anxiety that social beings have access to. But note what it does not provide. It does not provide accuracy. Someone's approval of your decision does not mean the decision is right. Someone's disapproval does not mean it is wrong. Approval is a social signal, not an objective assessment. It tells you about the person's preferences and the social norms of their context. It tells you very little about the merit of what you are doing. And yet the approval-seeking mind treats approval as though it were merit. It treats the receipt of validation as evidence that the decision was correct, and it treats the absence of validation as evidence that something might be wrong with the decision even when the decision is, objectively, a good one. This confusion of social signal for objective assessment is at the root of much of the paralysis and poor decision-making that approval-seeking produces, because it means you are outsourcing the judgment of your decisions to the opinions of others, and others' opinions are not calibrated to your life, your values, your particular circumstances, or your specific judgment. They are calibrated to their own preferences, their own experience, their own comfort, and the social norms of their own context. Which means they are genuinely unreliable as a guide to what is right for you. Acting without approval does not mean acting recklessly. It does not mean ignoring feedback or refusing to consider others' perspectives. There is genuine value in hearing others' views, in exposing your thinking to different perspectives, in being willing to update your plans based on legitimate challenges. But there is a difference between seeking input and seeking permission, between exposing your thinking to examination and requiring external validation before you can move, between considering others' perspectives and being unable to act until those perspectives are favorable. Acting without approval means moving on your own considered judgment after genuine reflection, after relevant input has been incorporated without requiring that the social environment endorse your action before you can take it. This is not always comfortable. The absence of external validation, when you are accustomed to requiring it, produces a particular kind of internal discomfort, a sense of exposure, a sense of vulnerability, a sense that something is unresolved because the social confirmation that you have been conditioned to treat as resolution is absent. This discomfort is information. It tells you that your nervous system has been trained to treat approval as a safety signal, and in its absence, a low-level alert is triggered. But this alert is not accurate. It is a trained response, not an accurate assessment of danger, and the practice of acting through it, of moving forward on your own judgment while the discomfort is still present, is how you begin to retrain it. Confidence in this context is not the absence of uncertainty. Genuine confidence is the willingness to act while uncertainty is present, to move forward without a guarantee, to take the risk of being wrong, of being criticized, of not being approved of, because waiting for certainty or waiting for approval is its own much larger risk. The much larger risk is a life spent in perpetual preparation, a life of plans that were never executed, of decisions that were never made, of movement that never occurred because the conditions for certainty and approval were never fully met. Because they never fully are. That is not pessimism. That is simply how life works. Certainty is almost never available before the fact, and approval, while often present, often generous, cannot be guaranteed. Acting in spite of this, rather than waiting because of it, is what forward movement actually looks like. There is something specific that happens psychologically when you begin to act without approval. Initially, as noted, there is discomfort. The absence of the expected validation produces a kind of internal unease. You are waiting without intending to for a signal that is not coming, and that waiting has a quality of incompleteness to it. But then something else begins to happen. You act, and the action produces its own information. The world responds to what you actually do, and that response, whatever it is, gives you something real to work with. Something more concrete and more useful than the abstract social approval you had been waiting for. And over time, as you accumulate the experience of acting and of navigating the responses your actions produce, something shifts in your relationship to approval. It becomes less necessary. Not because you stop caring what others think. Caring about others' perspectives is natural and appropriate, but because you develop a different primary source of information about your own actions, the direct feedback of consequences, of outcomes, of the actual results of your decisions in the actual world. This is a far more reliable guide than approval, because approval is retrospective and social. Consequences are direct and real. Freedom, in the deepest practical sense, is the capacity to move in the direction you have determined without requiring the social environment to endorse that direction first. It is the capacity to write the thing without waiting for permission to be a writer, to start the project without waiting for someone to confirm it is a good idea, to change the direction without waiting for approval from people who are comfortable with the current one, to say what you actually think without first checking whether it will be well received. This freedom is not arrogance. It is not indifference to others. It is the simple, functional capacity to be the author of your own movement, to be the one who initiates, who decides, who acts, rather than the one who waits for the social environment to indicate that acting is permissible. Most of what you have not done, most of the movement that has remained theoretical, the ideas that have remained ideas, the decisions that have remained unmade, has remained that way not because you lacked ability, not because the conditions were not right, but because you were waiting for enough certainty, waiting for enough approval, waiting for the external environment to provide a signal that it was safe to move. That signal will not come in advance. It only comes, if it comes at all, after you have moved, You do not need permission to move forward. You never did. The only permission that was ever actually required was your own. Start there, in the smallest decision, in the most ordinary moment. Begin to act from your own considered judgment, without checking for approval before you do. Notice the discomfort, allow it to be present, and move anyway. That movement, that specific act of moving through the discomfort of unvalidated action, is where psychological freedom begins. It is not a single act, it is a practice, but it is the practice that changes everything downstream. Act without waiting, without needing permission. Move. Chapter 8. Emotional self-sufficiency. There is a specific kind of suffering that is generated not by what happens to you, but by what you require of others. This suffering is quiet. It is often mistaken for sensitivity, or for the natural pain of caring deeply, but its actual source is the gap between what you have come to require from others and what they are actually providing. The larger that gap, the greater the suffering, and the size of that gap is not determined by how poorly others behave. It is determined by how large your requirements are. Emotional self-sufficiency is the capacity to meet your own emotional needs with enough consistency that others' behavior, while it may matter, while it may be pleasant or unpleasant, does not become the primary driver of your internal state. This is not the same as not caring. It is not the same as emotional isolation. It is not the achievement of a state in which others' behavior is entirely irrelevant to you. Human beings are social, and the influence of others on our internal experience is both real and appropriate. The distinction is between appropriate influence and structural requirement, between finding warmth in someone's presence and needing their presence to regulate your internal state, between appreciating someone's validation and requiring it to feel confident, between enjoying connection and depending on it for stability. When others' behavior becomes a structural requirement, when their approval, their attention, their availability, their consistency is the condition for your internal stability, you have moved from appropriate influence into emotional dependence. And that dependence generates a particular quality of suffering that is distinct from other kinds of pain. It is the suffering of someone who is always slightly at the mercy of another person's choices, who is always at some level waiting, monitoring, watching for the signals that will tell them whether today will feel stable or not, whether the approval will be present or absent, whether the attention will be forthcoming or withdrawn. This is not love. This is not sensitivity. This is the specific and avoidable suffering of a person whose internal stability depends on external variables they cannot control. Detachment, as it applies here, is not indifference. This is worth being very clear about, because the word is often misunderstood. Psychological detachment is not the absence of care. It is not the removal of genuine feeling. It is a quality of relationship to your own experience and to others that allows you to engage fully without being consumed, to feel without being controlled by feeling, to care about others without your care becoming a requirement that they fulfill. The person who has developed genuine detachment is not cold. They are present. They engage deeply. They feel genuinely. But their internal state does not collapse when the external doesn't provide what they want. They can love someone without that love becoming a dependency. They can value a relationship without its continuation becoming a requirement for their stability. This is the quality that emotional self-sufficiency produces, and it is one of the most powerful positions available to a human being, because it allows for full engagement without the vulnerability that comes from having your internal foundation located outside of you. The development of emotional self-sufficiency involves two parallel practices. The first is the practice of meeting your own emotional needs directly, not bypassing them, not suppressing them, but finding the capacity to address them from within rather than requiring external resolution. When you feel the need for reassurance, before reaching outward for it, you practice providing it to yourself, not through false affirmations, not through self-deception about how things are going, but through an honest assessment of your own capacities, your own history of navigating difficulty, your own genuine strengths, through the recognition that uncertainty is tolerable even when it is uncomfortable, through the deliberate return to your own stable ground rather than the reflexive movement toward external comfort. This is difficult at first, not because you lack the resources, but because you are unaccustomed to accessing them. The habit of moving outward is so practiced that moving inward, staying inward, finding stability inward, it takes more effort initially. It feels unfamiliar. It may feel lonely, at first in a way that is uncomfortable. But the loneliness is not evidence that you are doing it wrong. It is evidence that you are in new territory, and new territory navigated consistently becomes familiar. The second practice is learning to receive others' care and presence without requiring it. This is subtler and perhaps more important than the first, because the goal is not to eliminate the experience of receiving care from others. The goal is to change your relationship to it, to move from requiring it to enjoying it. When you require something, its absence is a crisis. When you enjoy something, its absence is an inconvenience at most. The felt experience of those two positions is entirely different, and the capacity to engage with others' care, attention, and presence from the position of enjoyment rather than requirement transforms every relationship you are in. Because from the position of requirement, relationships are about need management, about monitoring whether the need is being met, adjusting your behavior to ensure it continues to be met, and experiencing distress when it is not. This is exhausting for both you and the other person. From the position of enjoyment, relationships are about genuine exchange, about two people who bring their own internal stability to the encounter and choose, from that stable position, to engage with each other, to offer care, to receive care, to share experience, not because they require it to function, but because it is genuinely pleasant and meaningful and enriching. The shift from requirement to enjoyment does not happen through a single decision. It happens through the development of emotional self-sufficiency, through the accumulation of experience in meeting your own emotional needs, managing your own internal states, navigating difficulty from your own internal resources. As that capacity develops, the urgency around others' behavior naturally decreases, not because you stop caring about them, but because the stakes have changed. When their behavior is no longer the condition for your stability, it is no longer experienced as threatening when it doesn't meet your preferences. It becomes, genuinely, their behavior something that is relevant to you, that you may enjoy or prefer to be different, but that does not determine your internal state. Control in the context of emotional self-sufficiency is not control over others. It is control over the quality of your own internal experience. Specifically, it is the capacity to maintain a functional internal state regardless of what the external environment is providing. Not through suppression, not through denial, but through the genuine development of internal regulatory resources that are robust enough to operate independently of external input. This is one of the most significant forms of psychological freedom available. Because when your internal state is primarily self-regulated, when your stability comes from your own internal architecture rather than from external conditions, you are no longer at the mercy of what others do. You are no longer waiting for someone else's behavior to determine how you will feel today. You determine how you will feel, not through force of will, but through the consistent application of internal practices that keep you grounded in your own stable position. When you stop requiring, at the structural level, that others provide what you can provide for yourself, something shifts. The chronic low-level suffering of unmet requirements begins to decrease, not because others have become more reliable, but because you are no longer in the position of requiring their reliability for your stability. And as that suffering decreases, something unexpected often happens. Your relationships genuinely improve, because you bring less weight to them, because others feel the difference between being chosen and being required. Because the space between you and others opens up into something that can be genuinely shared rather than something that is structured by need. This is the paradox of emotional self-sufficiency. You do not end up with less connection. You end up with more genuine, more freely chosen, more equal, more real. Begin the practice. Begin with small moments of staying with your own experience rather than immediately seeking external resolution. Begin with noticing the impulse to seek reassurance and choosing, sometimes, to stay with the discomfort instead. Begin with the practice of meeting yourself where you are, of bringing your own attention, your own steadiness, your own honest acknowledgement to whatever you are experiencing before looking outward. This is the practice. It is not one thing. It is the repeated, gradual, consistent building of an internal life that is rich enough, stable enough, well-developed enough to be genuinely self-sustaining. Not self-contained, not isolated, but self-sustaining. That is the difference that makes everything else possible. Chapter 9. Building a strong mind. A strong mind is not one that is immune to difficulty. It is not one that feels nothing, that is never uncertain, that never encounters situations in which the right response is unclear. These are fantasies, not descriptions of strength. A strong mind is one that encounters difficulty, encounters pressure, uncertainty, contradiction, discomfort, and maintains its fundamental capacity to function. That does not fragment under stress. That does not require external support to remain operational. That processes hard information without being overwhelmed by it and makes considered decisions even when certainty is unavailable. This kind of strength is not a trait you either have or you don't. It is a capacity that is built, developed, strengthened through consistent, deliberate engagement with the practices that build it. Mental resilience is the first of these, and it is worth being precise about what resilience actually means, because it is frequently misunderstood. Resilience is not toughness in the sense of hardness. A hard thing does not bend, and because it does not bend, it breaks when sufficient force is applied. Resilience is suppleness combined with strength. It is the capacity to be moved by what is genuinely moving, to encounter difficulty and feel its impact while maintaining the structural integrity to recover and continue. The resilient mind is not unmoved by difficulty. It is not above being affected. It encounters difficulty genuinely and allows that encounter to register. But it has the internal organization to process that encounter without being destabilized by it, to absorb the impact without fracturing, to recover without requiring an extended period of external support. This capacity develops through exposure, not through forcing yourself into difficulty for its own sake, but through the practice of not avoiding what is genuinely difficult, through allowing challenges to be challenges rather than immediately seeking to mitigate them, smooth them over, or hand their resolution to someone else. The avoidance of difficulty is one of the primary things that keeps the mind weak, because avoidance prevents the development of the capacity to tolerate and process difficulty. And without that capacity, every new challenge feels more threatening than it is. The mind that has no practice with navigating difficulty treats ordinary hardship as exceptional hardship. It is overwhelmed by what a more practiced mind would handle with relative ease. Exposure, gradual, consistent, chosen, builds the capacity that avoidance prevents, not because you need to seek out suffering, but because when difficulty appears, as it inevitably does, you allow yourself to engage with it rather than immediately moving to reduce it through external means. You stay, you think, you navigate, and in doing so you build something. Focus is the second component of a strong mind, and in the current environment, an environment of unprecedented distraction, of constant competing demands for attention, of information arriving continuously from multiple simultaneous sources, focus is not simply a productivity tool. It is a measure of psychological strength. The capacity to focus, to hold sustained, undivided attention on a single object, task, or line of thought for an extended period is directly related to the capacity to resist the influence of external disruption. Because focus requires the active management of attention, the deliberate choice of what to attend to, and, equally important, what to decline to attend to. A mind that cannot focus cannot think deeply, and a mind that cannot think deeply is significantly more susceptible to superficial influence, to the opinions, moods, and pressures of the surrounding environment, because it does not have the internal depth to counterbalance them. Building focus is a practice. Specifically, it is the practice of deliberately choosing where to place your attention and maintaining that choice in the face of competing demands. This does not require long, uninterrupted hours of effort. It begins with shorter periods of deliberate, undivided engagement, periods in which you resist the impulse to check, to shift, to attend to something else, and extend them gradually as the capacity grows. What you are building through this practice is attentional discipline, the capacity to choose your object of attention rather than having your attention chosen for you by whatever is most stimulating in the environment. This is not a small thing. This is the foundation of genuine independent thought, because you cannot think clearly about something you are not attending to fully. Discipline, in the broadest sense, is what gives the other components of a strong mind their durability. Resilience that is practiced occasionally but not maintained is fragile. It may be available in a crisis, but not in the sustained pressure of ordinary life. Focus that is applied sporadically does not produce the depth of engagement that genuine independent thinking requires. Stability that is only present during favorable conditions is not stability at all. What makes these capacities durable is consistency, and consistency is what discipline produces, not the dramatic, heroic consistency of exceptional effort on exceptional occasions, but the ordinary, unglamorous consistency of maintaining your practices regardless of whether the conditions feel optimal. On the days when you are motivated, maintaining your practices is relatively easy. On the days when you are tired, when nothing is working particularly well, when the internal environment is noisy and the external environment is demanding, maintaining your practices is harder and more important. Because the capacity of the mind under pressure is not measured by its performance when conditions are favorable. It is measured by its performance when they are not. Stability, in this chapter's context, is not the emotional stability of Chapter 5, though the two are related. Here it refers to cognitive stability, the quality of your thinking under pressure. A cognitively stable mind does not catastrophize. It does not take an ambiguous piece of information and rapidly construct the worst-case interpretation. It does not allow the emotional intensity of a situation to overwhelm the quality of its analysis. It does not make its most important decisions at its most agitated moments. Cognitive stability means that your thinking maintains a certain quality regardless of the intensity of what you are experiencing, that you can analyze clearly under pressure, that you can hold multiple considerations in mind simultaneously without collapsing the complexity prematurely, that you can delay a decision until you have the information and the composure to make it well, rather than making it quickly to relieve the discomfort of uncertainty. This quality, cognitive stability under pressure, is one of the most practically valuable things a human being can develop, because the most consequential decisions of your life will not typically occur under optimal conditions. They will occur under pressure, under uncertainty, under the influence of emotion, under the competing demands of multiple stakeholders with different interests. And the quality of those decisions will be determined largely by the quality of your thinking at those moments. A strong mind, developed through consistent practice, maintains cognitive capacity when it is most needed, not because it is indifferent to the pressure, but because it has developed the structural depth to think effectively even while that pressure is fully felt. There is also the matter of influence resistance. A strong mind is not one that is impervious to influence. That would be a closed mind. Not a strong one, but it is one that has sufficient internal depth and structure that influence must come through the front door, through examination, through consideration, through engagement with evidence. A mind without sufficient internal depth is influenced through the side door, through repetition, through social pressure, through emotional manipulation, through the sheer ambient presence of a perspective that is never examined but simply absorbed. The strong mind can be genuinely changed by a good argument, but it will not be changed simply because a persuasive personality delivered it. It will not shift simply because everyone around it holds a certain view. It will not bend simply because there is social pressure to do so. This is not stubbornness, it is intellectual integrity. And intellectual integrity is a component of mental strength that is just as important as emotional resilience or cognitive stability. The practices that build a strong mind are not mystical. They are not particularly sophisticated. but they are consistent, they are sustainable, and they are yours to engage with. Beginning now. The practice of sitting with difficulty rather than immediately resolving it through external means. The practice of sustained focus, extended gradually over time. The practice of maintaining your internal disciplines even when the conditions are not optimal. The practice of examining rather than absorbing what arrives from outside. These practices, maintained consistently, produce something that cannot be produced any other way: a mind that is genuinely strong, that can be trusted, that does not need external support to function at a high level, that faces the full range of what life presents without collapsing under it. This is not the strength of someone who has had things easy. It is the strength of someone who has built deliberately, consistently, over time, something that can handle what is hard. And what is hard you can now handle. Not because you were told you could, because you built the capacity. That is different. That is real. Chapter 10. Choosing people, not needing them. There is a position in relationship that most people have never fully occupied, not because it is unavailable to them, but because the internal work required to access it has not been done. The position is this: to be in genuine relationship with someone, to care for them, to enjoy their company, to value what they bring to your life from a place of genuine choice, not from need, not from the structural requirement that they be there for you to feel okay, but from the free, deliberate, internally stable choice to have them in your life because you genuinely want them there. This is the position that everything in this audiobook has been building toward. Not a life without people, but a life in which your relationships were genuinely yours, chosen freely, maintained freely, valued for what they actually are rather than for what you require them to provide. The difference between choosing someone and needing them may sound subtle, but in lived experience it is profound. When you need someone, the relationship operates under a particular kind of pressure. There is something at stake beyond the relationship itself: your stability, your sense of identity, your sense of being okay. And that additional stake changes the quality of the engagement. It introduces an element of management, of monitoring, of adjustment based on what is required to maintain the relationship in the form that keeps providing what you need. This management is often below the level of awareness. It does not feel like management. It feels like caring, like attention, like the natural attentiveness of someone who values another person. But the quality is different, and the other person can feel it even if they cannot articulate it. The subtle pressure of being required rather than chosen. The implicit weight of being someone's foundation rather than simply their companion. When you choose someone, when the relationship is maintained not by need but by genuine preference, the dynamic changes entirely. There is no management. There is no monitoring to ensure the supply of what you require continues. There is simply the genuine pleasure of another person's company, the real interest in who they are, how they think, what they experience, the authentic care for their well-being that is possible only when your care is not entangled with your own structural requirements. This is what healthy relationship actually feels like. Not the anxious, effortful maintenance of a connection on which your stability depends, but the natural, low-pressure engagement with someone whose presence you genuinely enjoy and whose well-being you genuinely care about, independent of what they provide for you. Boundaries in this context are not primarily defensive structures. This is a common misunderstanding. People often think of boundaries as walls, as the things you put up to protect yourself from others. And in the context of dependent relationships, there can be a defensive quality to them. You need boundaries because you are vulnerable, because your stability depends on the relationship. And so you need to protect against behaviors that might destabilize it. But in the context of chosen relationship entered into from a position of internal stability rather than internal need. Boundaries are something different. They are expressions of self-knowledge. They are the natural expression of knowing what works for you and what doesn't. What you are willing to engage with and what falls outside what you are genuinely interested in offering. They are not defensive, they are simply honest. They communicate, without drama, where you actually or what serves the relationship and what doesn't. And because they come from a position of stability rather than fear, they can be communicated with relative ease, without the anxiety of someone who depends on the relationship and fears that the honest expression of their limits might damage it. Respect in relationship flows naturally from this kind of engagement. When you choose someone, when you are in relationship with them freely, from stability, without requiring them to be your foundation, you can see them more clearly. You can see them as they actually are, rather than through the distorting lens of what you need them to be. You can appreciate what they genuinely are rather than being perpetually disappointed by what they are not. And when you see someone clearly, you respect them more accurately. You do not project onto them requirements they cannot meet. You do not hold them responsible for providing what only you can provide for yourself. You engage with them as they are, with their actual character, their actual strengths and limitations, their actual presence, and that engagement produces something more real, more respectful, and more durable than the relationship organized around need can ever produce. Relationships that are chosen rather than required also tend to be more honest. In dependent relationships, a degree of dishonesty is almost structurally inevitable, because honest expression of your actual experience, your actual opinions, your actual needs when they conflict with the preferences of the person you depend on feels threatening. The honesty risks the relationship, and since you require the relationship, the risk feels genuinely dangerous. So you smooth things over, you hold back. You present the version of yourself that is most likely to maintain the relationship in the form that keeps it providing what you need. And over time, the relationship becomes organized around this performance rather than around what is actually true for either person. In a chosen relationship where neither person requires the other to maintain their stability, the stakes of honesty are lower, because the honesty cannot destabilize what was never built on a requirement. The relationship can survive, can even deepen through honest engagement with what is difficult, because both people have sufficient internal stability to tolerate the discomfort that honest conversation sometimes produces. This is why genuine intimacy, genuine closeness, genuine knowing of another person is accessible primarily in relationships that are chosen rather than required. Because genuine intimacy requires honesty, and honesty requires that the stakes be low enough to risk it. And the stakes are only low enough when neither person's stability depends on the relationship remaining conflict-free. You cannot be truly close to someone you are afraid to be honest with. And you can only be unafraid to be honest when your stability does not depend on their continued approval. The paradox of independence in the context of relationship is this: the more internally complete you become, the more genuinely self-sufficient. The more genuinely stable in your own internal resources, the more capable of genuine closeness you become. This is counterintuitive. People often assume that independence is opposed to closeness, that developing internal sufficiency means having less need for others, which means having less connection to others, that the end point of the work described in this audiobook is a kind of solitary, self-contained existence. That is not what happens. What happens is that the quality of the connection available to you changes. It deepens, not because you need others less. You may find that your desire for genuine connection actually increases as the anxious quality of your previous need for it decreases. But because the connection is now genuine, it is not organized by requirement. It is not shadowed by dependence. It is freely entered into, freely maintained, and freely offered. That kind of connection, freely chosen, genuinely mutual, honest, stable, is one of the most significant things available in human experience. It is what people mean when they describe a relationship as genuinely good, as genuinely nourishing, as something that actually adds to their life rather than something that is required to maintain it. And it is available to you, not as a distant aspiration, but as the natural outcome of the internal work this audiobook describes. The final practice of this chapter is the practice of discernment. From the position of internal stability, from the position of choosing rather than needing, you develop a clearer capacity to discern which relationships are genuinely worth your engagement and which are not. Because you are no longer driven by the requirement to maintain any particular relationship at any cost, you can assess, with some clarity and without excessive anxiety, whether a particular relationship is actually something you want in its current form. Not as a way of becoming ruthless about relationships, but as a way of being honest with yourself about which connections are genuinely enriching and which, upon examination, are neither serving you nor the other person. Chosen relationships can include all of the people you currently have in your life, or most of them. The transition is not typically about removing people. It is about changing the basis on which you engage with them, moving from a position of requirement to a position of choice. And from that position, the position of genuine choice, genuine stability, genuine independence that does not require aloneness, you can offer others something real, something that was not fully available before. The presence of someone who is genuinely there with them, not because they need to be, but because they want to be. That is the strongest position in relationship, not dominance, not distance, not need. Choice. Full, free, stable, internally grounded choice. Everything this audiobook has built is in service of that position. You are ready to occupy it. Closing. You have moved through a significant amount of territory. Not in the sense of covering ground quickly, but in the sense that the ground covered has genuine depth. The ideas in this audiobook are not techniques. They are not strategies in the way that a list of steps is a strategy. They are descriptions of how the mind actually works, how dependence forms, how it operates, how it costs you, and what the internal architecture of genuine independence actually looks like. Understanding this architecture does not automatically produce it. That would be too easy and it would be false. But understanding it gives you something crucial: the ability to see clearly what you are building toward. and you cannot build towards something you cannot see. Let us move through what has been established, not as a summary, but as a final consolidation, a final pressing of what was learned into the structure of who you are becoming. You now know why dependence formed, not because you were weak, not because you were broken, but because you were conditioned by a childhood that required reliance on others for survival, by social structures that consistently rewarded external orientation, by the absence of any genuine teaching about how to self-direct, how to self-regulate, how to be the primary author of your own internal experience. That conditioning was rational given the circumstances in which it formed, but it was not designed for the person you are now. And the fact that it formed rationally does not mean it must be maintained. What was learned can be examined. What is examined can be understood, and what is understood can be changed. You now know what support actually is, not a guaranteed structure on which you can rest the full weight of your internal stability, but a genuinely valuable, genuinely real addition to a life that is already stable on its own terms. Support that is received freely, enjoyed genuinely, and not required for your fundamental functioning. When you receive support from this position, it is wonderful. When it is absent, you continue. Not because you are above needing others, but because your stability does not live in them. It lives in you. You now know what you lose when you outsource your identity to others' approval. The quiet disappearance that happens when you adjust yourself, repeatedly and automatically, to meet the preferences of your social environment. The faintness of your own signal when it has been consistently overridden by external feedback. And you know that the recovery of that signal, the reestablishment of genuine contact with your own perspective, your own preferences, your own judgment is not a dramatic event. It is a practice, a daily, ongoing, sometimes uncomfortable practice of asking what you actually think before filtering it for acceptability. You now know that control, real control, functional control, the kind that actually changes how you live, is not something you exert over others. It is something you develop over yourself, over your internal responses, over the quality of your attention, over the direction of your choices, over the relationship between what you decide and what you actually do. And you know that this kind of control is built through responsibility, through the consistent practice of asking not what did they do, but how am I choosing to respond, through the deliberate, repeated choice to be the author of your internal experience rather than the passive recipient of whatever the external environment produces. You now know what internal stability actually requires. Not the right circumstances, not the right people behaving in the right ways, but a particular quality of relationship with yourself, a relationship characterized by trust, by consistency, by the capacity to be with your own experience without being overwhelmed by it, built through the practice of sitting with discomfort, of acting on self-trust, of maintaining your internal orientation even when conditions are difficult. Stability built this way does not disappear when circumstances change, because it was never dependent on circumstances. It was built from something more durable, your own practiced engagement with your own internal life. You now know that your thoughts are not always automatically yours, that influence is pervasive and often invisible, that the perspectives that feel most deeply your own are sometimes the ones that were absorbed most completely, never examined, never questioned, never genuinely considered. And you know the difference between genuine independent thought and social conformity dressed as opinion. between thinking that has been arrived at through genuine engagement with evidence and reflection, and thinking that has been adopted because the social cost of not adopting it was higher than the cost of examination. That difference is not always comfortable to apply, but it is the foundation of intellectual integrity. And intellectual integrity is a form of internal freedom that very few people access fully. You now know that approval was never the permission you were waiting for, that the action you have been deferring, the decision you have been delaying, the movement you have been preparing to begin for as long as you can remember was never waiting for someone else's endorsement. It was waiting for yours. Your own considered judgment, your own deliberate choice, your own permission to move in the direction you have determined, without requiring the social environment to find it acceptable before you proceed. Acting without approval is not the act of someone who doesn't care what others think. It is the act of someone who cares about their own considered judgment more than they care about avoiding social discomfort. That is not indifference, that is priority, and it is yours to exercise. You now know that emotional self-sufficiency is not the absence of feeling. It is not isolation. It is not the achievement of a state where others' behavior no longer matters. It is the development of a rich enough internal life that others' behavior is influential rather than determinative, that you can receive care without requiring it, that you can experience loss without being structurally devastated by it, that you can love without that love becoming a requirement the other person must fulfill to maintain your stability. This is what makes genuine closeness possible, not despite independence, but because of it. You now know what a strong mind actually is. Not hard, not immune, not above being affected, but organized at a depth that allows it to maintain its fundamental capacity through difficulty, pressure, uncertainty, and discomfort. A mind that does not require external support to function, that processes hard information without fragmenting, that makes considered decisions even when certainty is unavailable. This strength is built. It is the product of consistent, deliberate, sustained engagement with the practices that produce it, and it strengthens through use through every encounter with difficulty that you navigate rather than avoid, through every period of sustained focus you maintain, through every decision you make from your own considered judgment rather than from the pressure of external expectation. And you now know that the strongest position in relationship is not one of self-containment or of need. It is the position of genuine choice, of choosing people freely from a position of internal stability, without requiring them to be what only you can be for yourself, of engaging with others fully, honestly, warmly from a foundation that is yours, that does not require their maintenance, that remains stable whether they are present or not. From that position, relationship is not a dependency. It is a richness, an addition to a life that is already genuinely sufficient. Something that is present not because you require it for your basic functioning, but because it is genuinely good, genuinely pleasant, genuinely meaningful, genuinely worth choosing again and again. This is the transformation that has been built through the pages of this audiobook. Not a transformation from someone who cares to someone who doesn't. Not from connection to isolation. Not from sensitivity to hardness. From reactive to deliberate. From scattered to precise. From external to internal. From waiting to moving. From requiring to choosing. The work does not end here. The understanding that has been established in this listening needs to be carried forward into the ordinary fabric of your daily experience, into the small moments, the impulse to seek reassurance, noticed and examined, the decision made from your own judgment, without waiting for validation, the difficult emotion stayed with rather than immediately resolved through external means, the thought examined rather than absorbed, the action taken without requiring permission. These are the moments in which the transformation is made real, not in grand gestures, not in single defining events, but in the accumulation of small, deliberate engagements with the practices that build the architecture you have been learning about. You do not need to remove people from your life. You need to remove your dependence on them. Because when you do, when the structural requirement is removed and what remains is genuine, freely wholesome connection, you will find something surprising. You will not find yourself more alone. You will find yourself more capable of genuine closeness than you have ever been. And the people who remain in your life, the ones who choose to be there and whom you choose in return, will feel the difference. They will feel that they are with someone who is actually present, who is genuinely there with them rather than monitoring them, who can receive without requiring, who can care without depending, who can be affected without being consumed. They will feel they are with someone who is free, because that is what you are now. Not free of others, not free from care, from connection, from the genuine and deeply human pleasure of another person's company. Free in your relationship to all of it. Free to choose. Free to engage. Free to leave a conversation and remain intact. Free to return to yourself reliably and without drama whenever the world outside pulls too hard in too many directions. This is the quiet strength this audiobook was always about. Not cloudness, not hardness, not distance. The quiet, composed, deeply capable strength of a person who knows where they stand, who does not require confirmation to know it, who moves from their own center, their own judgment, their own considered engagement with life. That person is not who you were told to be, but it is who you are capable of becoming. The path from here is yours to walk. Walk it deliberately. Walk it with precision. Walk it without waiting for permission. And walk it knowing what you now know, that the stability you were looking for was always here, inside you, available to you, waiting not for the right circumstances or the right people, but for the right relationship with yourself. You have begun building that relationship. Continue. End of audiobook.